Okay, is that right? Not too loud. So I'm going to discuss today the importance and the underpinning science of recovery nutrition. I must add that the main points of my presentation have already been discussed today. But for me, that just highlights their importance, and it won't hurt you to hear them again. But I'll try to give it a bit more of a local spin, because that's really what I'm interested in, is the way that we can use recovery nutrition with our athletes here in Qatar, in particularly football. So I'm just going to give a quick overview of recovery, then look at refueling, muscle repair, touch on rehydration, a little bit about immune function, and then the practical advice and practical tips for recovery nutrition. So to start, recovery involves a complex array of desirable processes of adaptation to physiological stress. And the aim of recovery nutrition is to refuel muscle and liver glycogen, replace fluid loss, and in particular electrolytes with that fluid, and for muscle repair and adaptation to training. And what I don't think anyone's alluded to really is what is the purpose of doing this is to improve athletic performance. So with a scheduled workload, adequate recovery periods, we can hopefully improve athletic performance. And what are the practical implications from recovery nutrition that can affect this? Fatigue. So for example, if an athlete has had a particularly hard training session, they may be unwilling or unable to take recovery nutrition. Loss of appetite. Personally, I'd say that's the one we'd come across the most, where the athletes or the footballer has finished a match and isn't interested in taking your recovery food or recovery shake. There's also post-exercise commitments, and this can range from extended warm down, or if it's an important match, maybe there's press commitments, anything that will prevent the athlete from taking recovery nutrition within the optimum time frame. So the way to get around this is for the best part to plan for optimal recovery, know what's happening with the game, know what athletes, once you know your team, know what athletes are like, and try and make it more individualized. And that's really the overview of my presentation, is that there is no one size fits all for recovery nutrition. Although the guidelines will be broad and that you can apply it to every athlete, each athlete's different. Okay, so I say to maintain optimal health and performance by the increased needs for some nutrients resulting from heavy training or matches. So football's a very varied game. You've got goalkeepers who may not have very much energy expenditure during a match, a striker who may run 1.5 kilometers, or you may have an outfield player, your old Cafus or David Beckhams, that run up to 13 kilometers in a game. Now the nutritional needs of those players are going to vary. So there's going to be a glycogen drain and muscle protein in those players that have run further. It's obviously going to be a greater effect. And I've put there that players may lose an average of 1.5 litres a game. But as I'll explain later, in Qatar, that can be a lot greater than that. So, refueling. Muscle glycogen is the primary source of fuel for moderate to high intensity exercise, the exercise we'd experience during football for most players. Glycogen depletion will be a major cause of fatigue during this exercise, and performance will be compromised by this inability to replenish the glycogen stores. So what's the aim of recovery nutrition? It's to optimize that glycogen status in both the muscle and the liver. So how do we do this? Exogenous carbohydrate. So it's the carbohydrate you can take before, during, and after a game. And this will increase insulin sensitivity and muscle permeability to glucose through GLUT4. So, advice: immediate intake of 1.2 grams of carbohydrate immediately post-training. This will enhance glycogen synthesis, and obviously without that carbohydrate, the rate of glycogen storage will be reduced, as I will demonstrate. So if you look here, just a very simple graph. This is a carbohydrate-based drink compared to water only, and as you can see, the glycogen storage is significantly higher post-recovery. But we just don't want to think about the carbohydrate intake immediately after training. We've got to think about the carbohydrate needs of the athlete throughout the 24 hours, throughout the whole day. So what are we looking at? Maximum glycogen storage for majority of athletes will occur at around 6 grams per kilogram of body weight. Now that can vary depending on your athlete's intensity, but I would suggest for the majority of footballers in Qatar that this is a good number to aim for. Okay, timing. The rate of muscle glycogen synthesis is about 30% faster in that first hour post-recovery compared to delayed feeding greater than 2 hours. But as we know, glycogen synthesis continues up to 72 hours after training, but that's just where the maximum rate would occur. And this is due to the activation of glycogen synthase, as I've mentioned, increased insulin sensitivity and permeability of muscle cell to glucose. So what are our needs, or what are the needs of the athlete? In that optimum window of 1 hour, we looked at 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, although limited evidence, but moderate to high GI, around 50 to 60 grams would be an ideal bolus. And the majority of athletes, the majority of footballers in Qatar should probably be aiming for 5 to 7 grams per kilogram of body weight a day. There may be individuals in a team that need to move slightly higher and maybe even into higher threshold of up to 12, but in my experience of the footballers in Qatar, they're probably more around this level here. Just purely based on their intensity and training needs, not due to their ability. Okay, so muscle repair and building. As we know, exercise not only promotes protein synthesis, but also stimulates protein breakdown. So we have to make the most of this, what is I consider a positive situation, and add dietary protein to maximize skeletal muscle reconditioning. Now, for those that you've noticed this, that's quite a broad range. 1.7 grams for a per kilogram of body weight per day would probably more for your strength athletes and for, say, your rugby players, that sort of athlete. And as we know, hypertrophy can occur at 1.2. However, to make this specific to a region, the majority of footballers, a large number of the footballers that we see have low muscle mass compared to, say, their Western counterparts of the same age, same height. Therefore, I suggest that somewhere in the region of these two figures is where they should aim for their protein intake to help build this new muscle and repair the muscle from the exercise they've completed. Okay, so how much are we going to give immediately post-exercise? So the dose response for protein synthesis, as illustrated here, you look at around 20 grams. Once you get above 20 grams of protein in a bolus post-exercise, the muscle protein synthesis really doesn't increase significantly. And also there's evidence to suggest that you can get oxygenation and deamination once you pass 25 grams in a bolus. So the suggestion would be 15 to 20 grams of protein immediately post-exercise. And this also, as was mentioned in an earlier presentation, it needs to be a good quality protein and provide essential amino acids. Evidence suggests between 6 to 9 grams. Okay, the nutritional partnership. So ideally, recovery shake or recovery food should be both carbohydrate and protein. The reason for this is that a carbohydrate and protein drink will have a greater effect on glycogen storage than a high carbohydrate drink alone, particularly if you see in that first 40 minutes, so in that first crucial window post exercise or post match. Fluids. I won't dwell on this too long. So we know fluids regulate body temperature. They're involved in muscle, brain, and joint function. And the increased metabolic heat through exercise increases sweat loss even in cold weather, even though it's not great, even swimmers sweat. Okay. Hyperhydration has a negative effect on aerobic performance. There's evidence to suggest it doesn't affect strength performance, but we're dealing with football, so it's important that we focus on aerobic performance. As you can see, I've put there the Qatar experience. When we've been monitoring sweat loss during games or trainings, some of the players have lost 3 litres in an hour during the height of summer. And that's a huge amount of fluid to lose. And as you can see, the relationship, this graph just demonstrates the relationship between dehydration and maximum performance. Okay, and based on that, as I've said before, there's not a one-size-fits-all. Fluid replacement should be individualized, as most say nutritionists or physiologists would do, weigh a player before training, weigh them afterwards, take into account all fluid taken in, and calculate the sweat loss for that player, and then make a personalized hydration strategy, hydration or rehydration plan. And this replacement should be about 150% of the deficit. So if a player loses 1 kilo, you want them to replenish 1.2 to 1.5 litres of fluid. And I keep in mind the ACSM 2007 standpoint that the body weight loss should be kept below 2%. And I'd like you to remember that because I'll come back to that in a second. Also, it's important, as previously mentioned, to replenish the electrolyte loss through sweat, in particularly sodium, around 50 to 80 millimoles. We saw it quoted as 60 earlier, so that fits in within that bracket. Practically, how can you do this? You can use electrolyte supplements like ORS, add it to water, or add it to inadequate fluids. So you've already got Gatorade and you need to increase the sodium content there. You can also have electrolytes that can be consumed from post-exercise snacks, sort of salty foods and so. Okay, so the advice that I've just gone over is the ACSM 2007 standpoint, which is prevent of excess dehydration, as mentioned, as greater than 2% body weight loss. However, there is a new school of thought that's becoming quite popular as, well, not demonstrated, but as advocated by Professor Tim Noakes, that actually the dictation of first will allow an athlete to maintain adequate hydration to prevent a negative effect on a performance, provided fluid is available to that athlete. Now, I'm not saying that I necessarily agree with this, but I think it needs more evidence, because particularly here in Qatar, when we look at the hydration scores of a lot of our players, they can be severely dehydrated by Western measures, but still able to perform during football matches. So I just pose it to you as a question, as an idea, just to think about that the players here seem to be performing in a dehydrated state. Okay, very quickly, immune system. See, with intense and prolonged exercise, immune function can be compromised. There's some evidence to suggest that key vitamins and minerals, antioxidants, and energy are needed to maintain health and performance, particularly in periods of high or intense training. I mean, as it was alluded to in Martin's presentation, sometimes the football teams will be playing a game every 48 hours during a tournament or a pre-tournament competition. And what we're aiming for is real food. So we would like them to have a good carbohydrate intake and a good vitamin C intake, as well as looking towards vitamins A, E, glutamine, zinc, and even we are giving some of our players probiotics. It's worth looking at, it's in red because I really would like to push real food over supplements. However, obviously some players, they may have deficiency and there may be no other choice but to supplement with iron or calcium deficiency depending, or vitamin D, which is quite prevalent as well. Which brings me to this point of supplements versus real food. And I'd like to thank Professor Dupont for his note of chocolate milk, because I actually genuinely think that chocolate milk is probably one of the best recovery foods that we could actually promote, because it's safe, it's cheap, it provides all the macronutrients needed for recovery, and more. But the thing is, supplements are appealing. They're sporty. Athletes are sponsored by protein powders and Gatorade and various other things. But I bring and they're more convenient, or can be. They're ready to drink, or they're easy to mix up, and it's easier to take a ready-to-drink protein shake than it is to make a sandwich. And yeah, there's evidence, lots of evidence to show that protein, carbohydrate, and creatine supplements work and have ergogenic effects and can increase lean body tissue. However, I bring to the negatives of them is excess. So if a player finishes a training session and you give them a recovery shake, and they take this recovery shake straight away, and then they go off, as they do with their friends, and they go and eat. Now, maybe they didn't need to take that protein shake in the first place, and all they've done, or all we've done, is given them excess calories, and that player may have a weight problem. So they've just taken a protein shake, half an hour later they're getting a meal, whether it's a takeaway or a healthy meal, they're still taking excess energy in. So that's the other thing to take into account. And obviously I don't want to get into a deep conversation about this because it's a completely different subject, but obviously we need to take into account safety with supplements, and they have to be supplements that are batch tested, have certificates of traceability, and have come from a verified source. So really to summarize that, we're not looking for anything weird and wonderful in terms of a recovery snack. Ideally, should be taken within 30 minutes post-training, wherever possible, or post-match. Should include fluid and solid food. Aim for a ratio of 3:1 carbohydrate to protein, so 50 to 60 grams of carbohydrate, 15 to 20 grams of protein. Should include a sodium and potassium content, particularly sodium. And you can do this from an individualized approach for measuring the sweat loss. Low in fat, that's not necessarily because of the excess energy that you would get from fat, but we're trying to avoid, if a recovery shake was high in fat, for example, you could get delayed gastric emptying and therefore reduce the importance of taking it within 30 minutes. And the idea of that recovery shake would be to facilitate rehydration, replenish lost glycogen stores, and facilitate muscle repair and adaptation. So here's some simple nutritional examples of carbohydrate-only foods. So these could be taken directly after training, as could the carbohydrate and protein food. So there you are, milk's there for a recovery shake, chocolate milk again, or a small sandwich. But again, this is probably more convenient than this, and that's a real world issue that we need to take into account. Which brings me to my final point. It's all very well me standing up here talking about recovery nutrition for football players and that we can give them supplements and various other things. But in my experience, and I think most of you would agree, the baseline diet with most of these athletes and most of these footballers is very poor. And we are basically trying to ice a moldy cake. So I think the importance is to get that base diet. If we get that correct, we're going to have a greater effect with these players here in Qatar than we will with all the recovery nutrition and all the supplements. I'm not saying we should not attempt recovery nutrition. I'm just saying that we should try and simultaneously improve both. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. And I did undersell, while he hasn't finished his PhD until next Tuesday, Richard is the reigning Mr. Aspetar, so we do need to give him the deference he is due. Do we have any diet questions before we move on to trying to sum up the day? Any questions specific to post-exercise diet? Chris, yeah?
Yeah, about the, specifically in Qatar, do you manage the osmolarity response during exercise or during the recovery period?
Do we manage?
Yeah.
Just repeat the question.
Okay, so that was, do we manage the osmolarity of the sports drink here in Qatar? The majority of the sports drink that we use is ready to drink Gatorade. So therefore we don't have control over it as such in its package form, but then if we need to and we have access to it, we would add ORS when necessary.
It means it's ready to drink bottles?
Yeah, ready to drink bottles, the majority. Oh, we do have powders as well, but again, through convenience and preference, the players prefer the ready to drink. And to be honest, getting some of these players to drink anything is a challenge. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Is there anything healthy about a Qatari diet?
In principle, yes. I mean, if you consider the majority of when we would say do diet histories, it's not the principal elements of the diet that's an issue, it's the excess. So for example, there's a lot of meat, rice and fish. Well, you can't argue with rice and meat, but it depends on the method of cooking, and that's where we need to not only educate the players, but we need to educate the families about it's not just rice and meat. Doesn't mean that you can make rice and meat here, someone else can make rice and meat over there, and they can be almost very different dishes depending on if you added ghee or oil or various other things. Mm. This is it. Again, it's I go back. It's about education, I think. and educating the families as well as the players.
Players who sleep less hours, the same players sleeping 7-8 hours per night or sleeping 4-5 hours because of the course or because of the needs different nutrition, different diets, different elements.
I would, my quick answer would be no. The first response would, going on from the sleep presentations, that they need more sleep. In terms of timing, they could alter the timing of the meals, but in terms of their macronutrient intake, that would be determined by their body composition and their physical activity levels.
I would like to know your opinion regarding you are speaking about young
Yeah.
and in a higher level, for example, we have been shown recently that the responses of the players, the female players, regarding some biochemical marker, seems to be dependent from the nutrition that they have been doing. So, which space do you think that could be countered with the organization of a team that related with the nutrition?
Sorry, can you just repeat that last bit?
Recently,
Yeah.
it was being observed
Yeah.
that the responses after a match, namely biochemical responses, study lack performance parameters, but of course you can affect the connection that people made for diet, is related with micronutrient intake during filming.
Okay.
The Spanish study. What I want to know regarding your opinion is that this gives more space for the nutritionist inside a high-level team. So what do you think about this?
That study allows nutritionists to have a greater influence on the dietary intake. Is that the question that you're?
Yes, because it seems that is related.
Yeah. Well,
Strong association.
obviously, I think that's.
influence recovery, research.
I think it's a very important factor, and I think we need to, from a nutrition point of view, create diets for individuals within that team, as well as a sort of general dietary advice for that team to ensure that they are getting adequate micronutrients and also the timing of the macronutrients throughout the week and within each day. So it's not just about what they're eating, it's how they're eating it and what times they're eating it as well. If they eat that correctly through each day and they're repeating that throughout the week, then that should give them a better basis come the weekend if that's when they're playing.
I only saying this why because sometimes coaches it's difficult from a nutritionist where to assess
Hmm.
launching steroids. I think sometimes it's always a play.
Mhm.
And it's not easy for nutritionists and I believe sometimes to manage totally the dietary composition of the of the team. So coaches like to give their opinion and if their experience and practice regarding this.
Of course, and the way that I would deal with that is that you need to build a rapport with the coach, show, if necessary, show them evidence, basically emphasize the importance of adequate nutrition, and then that's to get the coach on board, and then you've got the practical issues. If you have, for example, a team in camp and they're in a hotel, sure, you can control what the hotel, to some extent, what the hotel is producing for the team, but it's when they're going home, or say they're not in a hotel and you have no control of them, and they're going home and they're eating whatever they want. They're going out and they're eating McDonald's, they're going home and eating huge portion sizes, but that's more about education than having sort of, obviously you'd always want the permission and the backing of the coach, but sometimes you've just got to sort of fight to show what you really want to do and the reason for it.
Okay, now this final section, if I could just